All righty. Hi, everyone. Shalom and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for a special Yom Haatzmaut program celebrating the miracle of Israel's independence and enduring power of Jewish culture and the Jewish language of Hebrew. Today also kicks off the first day of the month that is Jewish American Heritage Month. So definitely welcome to that. You can check out opportunities both with American Jewish University and with organizations across the US on the link that I will put in the chat. So definitely check that out. Today, we're thrilled to explore one of the most remarkable aspects of our heritage, the Hebrew language, with none other than Elon Gilad, who is a journalist, historian, and author. His works bring ancient and modern language of Hebrew to life, which is very exciting and what we're going to be exploring today. In this session, Elon will guide us through the deep Semitic roots of Hebrew, showing how this ancient language has endured and evolved over a millennia, from biblical text to modern Israeli slang. Together, we'll discover the hidden stories behind words that we may use every day and how they reflect the cultural, historical, and spiritual journey of the Jewish people. This class is brought to you by Hebrew at AJU, and we are grateful to our generous sponsors who made today possible: Janine Winkler-Lowy, Lisa Lehner-Fagan and Brian Fagan, Arna and David Pilemer, and Angel Schneider. Thank you all so much for supporting Hebrew learning and Jewish life at American Jewish University. But without further ado, I want to hand it on over to Elon and his fantastic presentation on the etymology of Hebrew. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I want to thank the AJU's Wisdom Center for Open Learning for hosting us. Thank you very much. And to thank all of you for joining in. And let's just start then. Okay. Instead of, we will be talking about the history of Hebrew, but instead of this like a timeline, which could be a little dry, we'll explore the history of Hebrew through the stories of particular words. And we'll start with some of the most basic words in any language, the names of the numbers. Okay, so you're probably familiar with the Hebrew word for 10, which is eser. But Hebrew is a member of a family of languages called the Semitic languages. And I don't know how many of you know all the Semitic languages or the names of the numbers in them, so we'll just run through some examples. So Amharic, which is the main language spoken in Ethiopia, that's a Semitic language, and they say asar. Then Tesha is 9 in Hebrew, and in Arabic it's Tis'ah. In Hebrew, Shmona, and in Tigrinya, which is the main language spoken in Eritrea and in that area of Africa, it's Shamonata. 7, Sheva in Hebrew, and in Tigre, another language spoken in that same area in Africa, it's Saboa. Shesh in Hebrew, and in Phoenician, which is an ancient language spoken on the shores of what is today Lebanon, it was something similar to Shesh. We just don't know what the vowels were because, you know, in Semitic languages, ancient Semitic languages, we didn't write the vowels. And then Chamesh in Hebrew, and in Ugaritic, which is another ancient Semitic language also spoken in what is today Lebanon. It was also Chamesh or something similar. Once again, we don't know what the vowels were. Arba, 4 in Hebrew, and in Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic used in certain churches in the East, they say Arba'a. And Shalosh for 3 in Hebrew, and in Mehari, it's Salit. That's a Semitic language that was spoken in the southern areas of the Arabian Peninsula, so think Yemen, but in antiquity. And Shtaim for 2 in Hebrew, and in Akkadian, you know, the ancient language of the Babylonians, it was Shita. So what we could see is that they're very similar. The numbers in all the Semitic languages are very similar to those in Hebrew. And that's because basic words, and the names of the numbers are basic words, tend to be very, they don't change a lot. They're the basic vocabulary, and they remain as they are, more or less. But if we look at the number one, which in Hebrew is echad, masculine, echat, feminine, we see something interesting. So in many of the Semitic languages, it's something similar. Syriac, chad, Arabic, wachad, etc. But then there's this whole other group of languages that have a different word for one. So Socrati, Mihari, Kabane, all those are ancient South Arabian languages. Those are languages spoken in the south of the Arabian Peninsula before Arabic took over everything. And also in Akkadian, so in Babylonia, they also use Ishtan. So what we can see is that in some Semitic languages, we have the same word, more or less, as the Hebrew word. But in others, there's a word that comes from the root Ein, Shin, Taf. And that's quite strange. So what's even stranger is that if we look in the Bible, we can find the same word also, the same word for one. Now, the regular word for one in the Bible is the same as we know. It's echad and echat. And the regular word for the phrase for 11 is echadesre. But in a few verses, and here's one verse from Exodus, they're talking about making the tabernacle. And it says, ועשית יריעות עזים לאוהל על המשכן, 12 יריעות תעשה. So you need to make 11 curtains for the tabernacle from goat hair. And here the phrase is 12, so it's 11. It's the same as other numbers. You say 12 for 12. But here the word for one is that Ein Shin Taf word. So it also existed in Hebrew, though it's gone today. So what happened here? We know because of the way that the Semitic languages are related to one another, that one of these had to be before the other. And because the Akkadian has that Ein Shin Taf word, and also the Bible has it, and those are very, very far on the family tree of Semitic languages, that has to be the earlier form. So the original, the Proto-Semitic word, the language that all Semitic languages developed from, the word for one was that Ein Shin Taf, Eshet word. And later, in some of the Semitic languages, very ancient times, it was switched over to Echad. What happened here is that Echad, we have this, the word Yachid, for example, in Hebrew, but also in Arabic and other Semitic languages. It means lone, alone. So what people started, instead of saying one child, they said lone child. And they used that phrase so much that that word for lone, echad, became the number one. And that left its mark on the way we use that number, because when we talk about numbers in Hebrew, we say shnei yeladim, shalosh yeladot. The number comes before the noun. But in one, it doesn't go that way. The word echad comes after the noun, which is not characteristic of numbers, but characteristic of adjectives. So the word for one in Hebrew, echad, still acts like an adjective. It follows the noun, which is interesting. So from these words and other words, scientists, scholars, linguists were able to build a family tree. You can see here that Hebrew appears in this Canaanite family together with Moabite and other languages that were spoken around the region. A little further from them is Aramaic, furthermore is Arabic, even further are the South Semitic languages like Ethiopic and those South Arabian languages, and the furthest are the East Semitic languages. Those are Babylonian and some other languages like that. And all these languages developed slowly from a language that scholars call Proto-Semitic, which based on calculations, these are statistical models that try to guess how long it took for these changes to develop. And based on those, we believe that Proto-Semitic was spoken about 6,000 years ago, probably in the deserts of Syria. So based on these words for numbers. In other words, we can trace back our heritage a lot before the time of the Bible to 6,000 years ago to these Proto-Semitic speakers there in Syria. But if we look at the Hebrew word for sickle, we might be able to even go further back into the past. So the word for sickle in Hebrew is magal. The word appears in the Bible. And as is expected, we can see it in other Semitic languages: Aramaic, Magla, Arabic, Minjal, Akkadian, Nigalu. So because all the Semitic languages share this word, we can hypothesize that the speakers of Proto-Semitic 6,000 years ago, they already had a word for sickle. They they called it nagal or something similar, and that word spread through the Semitic languages. Now, what's more surprising is that if you look at other non-Semitic languages, we also find the same word for sickle. And migama, neglat, and weriga, neglata, Somali, galef, and Moboroko, Galat. These are African languages, which I'm obviously not familiar with. I can't even pronounce their names. But they're Chadic and Cushic languages spoken in northern Africa. And this we already know, based on other similarities between words, that the Semitic languages are a part of a larger language family called the Afro-Asiatic languages. So that includes ancient Egyptian, the Berber languages of northern Africa, the Cushic and Chadic languages spoken elsewhere in Africa, and Semitic language is only one group of that. And once again, we can trace back using those statistical models that Proto-Afro-Asiatic was spoken about 10,000 years ago. Now, because the Chadic and Cushic languages have a word for sickle, we can hypothesize that the speakers of Proto-Afro-Asiatic already had sickles and 10,000 years ago and already had a word for them, which is very interesting because while sickles are not very common today, but for a long time they were very common. But not always. A sickle was an invention. And what's amazing is the sickle was invented about 10,000 years ago, together with the invention of agriculture, with the domestication of wheat and other grains. So if we look who had sickles 10,000 years ago, it doesn't leave a lot of options. In fact, it leads us to the inventors of the sickle and the inventors of agriculture, the people who domesticated wheat, which are the Natufians. The Natufians are a prehistoric culture. They didn't write or anything. And they lived around in and around what is today Israel. In fact, Natufian comes from the name of the first site where they were identified, which is Nahal Natuf, which is right next to Ben Gurion Airport. So from all this, what we learn is that we can trace, using some words, we can trace our heritage not to the Bible, much, much before the prehistoric time, to these ancient Natufian people that invented agriculture and the sickle. So that's more or less as far as we can go using language to look back. But it's interesting that is, there's no Hebrew here. We're not talking about Hebrew, and we came to talk about Hebrew. So let's jump forward thousands of years to where we actually have Hebrew, which is, of course, the Bible. There is records of biblical Hebrew, that's the Hebrew spoken in the First Temple period, from inscriptions here and there, but those are very short, fragmentary, and really the first real source we have for biblical Hebrew is the Bible. A few interesting things about the language of the Bible. For one, the core words in it, so as we said, the names of the numbers, the pronouns, the basic verbs, I did, I walked, I sat, all those are the same as the most basic and most common words in modern Hebrew. So the base of the language remained very consistent. So That's why modern Israeli children can read in the Bible and more or less understand it. This language was spoken more or less from sometime before the first kingdom, the kingdom, say Solomon, King David. So before that, 1200 BCE. And it remained in use, but it wasn't the spoken language after the fall of the First Temple period. In other words, we can trace people continuing to use biblical Hebrew, writing later biblical texts, and then the evolution of that is the texts we find in Qumran, which are using the same language, but it's more developed in all kinds of ways. But the language that Hebrew remained spoken in the Second Temple period, but it's not the same Hebrew. It's a different dialect of Hebrew from biblical Hebrew that developed into the rabbinic Hebrew. And we'll get back to that soon. Another thing we can say is that there isn't really a biblical Hebrew. The Hebrew in the Bible has stages. There's the early biblical Hebrew, so that's the biblical Hebrew from the First Temple period. That's what we find in the inscriptions in the letters of Lachish and stuff like that. But the later books of the Bible, think Ezra and Nehemiah, Divrei Yamim, Chronicles, Daniel, those books have more evolved, the later Second Temple period kind of Hebrew, which is different in all kinds of ways. I'll just give one example. The first person pronoun in the older parts of the book of the Bible are Anochi. Anochi Adonai Elohim. I am Adonai your God. But in later books in the Bible, there's less Anochi, and instead we use Ani. And of course, today in modern Hebrew, we also use ani, the more later version of that pronoun. And there's many other differences that we can go over, but we won't. And this leads to a question I'm asked a lot, whether if we were to, a Hebrew speaker, somebody who's a native Israeli Hebrew speaker, if he were to travel back in time and meet King David, would he be able to converse with him? And there's, as we already mentioned, we can read the Bible, so you might think that we could also talk to them. But reading and speaking isn't the same thing, and in all honesty, we would have a very difficult time talking to people in the biblical period. The main issue would be the pronunciation being different. The vowels are different, and also the consonants are different. Once again, we won't go into too much detail, but I'll give us an example. The consonant chet. In modern Israeli Hebrew, we say ch, right? And in all likelihood, biblical Hebrew also had a ch sound represented by chet. But we know that there were actually two chets. In other words, they used one letter, the letter chet, but it was pronounced in two ways. They didn't have two letters to distinguish between them, but a chet could be a ch, like ours, or a ha, like what's called here Mizrahi chet, or like Arabic kind of chet, more literal chet. And we know that even though they only represented it with one letter, that they distinguished between the two, even in later periods, because the translators of the Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, they distinguished between the two kinds of chet. They transliterated them differently. So if it was one chet, they would do one thing, and if it was a different chet, the other chet, they would do a different thing. And it's not that it's not arbitrary that which chet they use, because when we look at the Arabic word that's equivalent to it, and Arabic has two chets, and always when the Greeks transliterated one way, it's in Arabic the one chet, and when they transliterated the other way, it's the other chet, which means that at the time when they translated the Bible into Greek, about the 3rd century BC, they were still distinguishing between those two chets, and we, of course, do not anymore. So we would have a hard time, they would have a hard time understanding us. But it wouldn't be like going to a totally different language. In other words, you would be able to pick it up quite fast and learn to speak biblical Hebrew if you were to time travel. So if you can, I recommend you do so. Now, another issue with speaking to King David is that uh, obviously a lot of the vocabulary isn't the same. There's a lot of modern Hebrew words that they didn't have, and there's a lot of biblical Hebrew words that we don't know because most of the words in biblical Hebrew weren't recorded. This happened not to be in the Bible, and they're lost. We'll never know what they were. They're gone forever. But even words that did appear in biblical Hebrew and are in the Bible, and we are using them today, even those don't necessarily point to the same objects in the world. And as an example, I'd like to talk about the word Hasidah, because unlike other words, this one had real effects on the world. In other words, there were stakes here about what the word means. So we'll travel forward in time to the 13th century. And Rabbi Jacob Ben Asher traveled from Europe to find a job as a leader of a congregation in Spain. So he's then a rabbi in this congregation. And then suddenly he sees, what's going on? My congregation is eating storks, which are obviously not kosher. So don't they know that the Bible explicitly forbids eating the bird? The issue is that there's in the Bible there's two lists that repeat each other, um, listing the birds that aren't kosher. So there's all kinds of birds listed there, and one of them is the bird Hasidah. And since a stork is a Hasidah, he was scandalized. So what he did, he wrote his father, who was a much more famous rabbi, known as Harosh, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, and he asked him what to do about this. What is he supposed to do with the congregation eating this non-kosher bird? So the Rosh answered, stick to the traditions of the wise men of Ashkenaz, whose learning was inherited from the days of the destruction. Meaning that you can't trust those Sephardic Jews. They don't know what they're talking about. We, Ashkenazi Jews, our traditions go all the way back to the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. And we know best, so tell them to stop eating their storks and continue not eating them. So the real question is, okay, who's got it right? What was a stork? Because Rabbeinu Yerucham, another student of the Rosh, disagreed. He said, obviously storks are kosher because the Mishnah lists these signs for checking if a bird's kosher. The crop, the gizzard, a digit in the foot of the bird. There's a way to check if a bird is kosher or not. And I don't know what it is exactly. I'm not examining birds, but Rabbi Yerucham was an expert and he examined the stork and he said it checks out, it's kosher. So who's right? So the way we would check this to find out what a word in the Bible means is that we would see what people have said in the past. We're assuming that people in antiquity, being closer to the time of the writing of the Bible, they had good information on it. They knew what the word actually meant. So, and these early sources for us are usually the translations. So the most ancient translation is the Septuagint, translation into Greek, done in probably Alexandria by Hellenistic Jews living in Alexandria, as I said, about the 3rd century BC. But when they translated, apparently they already didn't know what Hasidah is, because the word appears not only in that list of the kosher birds, or unkosher birds, it also appears elsewhere in the Bible. And every place they translated with a different word. Once a heron, once a pelican, once a hoopie. I don't know if you know what these birds are, but they're very different birds, and none of them is a stork. And sometimes this transliterated it. So that's like, I don't know what it is. This transliterated what it is. Um, the Samaritans, which are not quite Jews but are sort of Jews, they have a very similar Torah to ours, and they translated it into Aramaic, and their translation, so their tradition, was that a Hasidah is a sparrow. Syriac, so that's a later Christian translation, translated Choba, which we also don't know what that is, so it doesn't really help us. And the Vulgate, the translation into Latin, this followed the Greek translation. So once again, no new information. So what we learn from this is already in antiquity, people didn't really know. And the most important translation for us Jews is the Aramaic Targum, because that's what the rabbis used. And for them, it was Daya chavarita. Daya is a kind of a bird of prey, and chavarita is this white, so it's some kind of white bird of prey. In the Talmud, that's what it says. It's a white bird of prey. There's a little information there to like try to guess what the etymology of the word is. And Hasidah is related to Chesed. So the bird, they say in the Talmud that the bird is known as a Hasidah because it's a kind bird. It helps its friends. And a little later, in Iraq in the 10th century, Rabbi Saadia Gaon, in his translation into Arabic, uses the word sakar, which is a kind of bird used for falconry, for hunting. So falcon or a similar bird. So in the Spanish Jews, they understood the stork to be some kind of bird of prey, like in the Talmud and like Rabbi Saadia Gaon. So where does this idea that Hasidah is a stork come from? And the answer is that Rashi apparently guessed, or one of Rashi's um, um, like rabbis. It might have been before him. But Rashi sometimes tells us that he's guessing about the words. And there's a lot of words in the Talmud or in the Bible that the modern day meaning comes from Rashi simply guessing. Another example, in addition to Hasidah being a stork, is the word bdolach in Genesis, which Rashi said meant crystal. It didn't, but we use it today to mean crystal. So that's the source of that. And because Rashi was such an important scholar and had such influence, not only did the Ashkenazi Jews stop not eat storks and believe the Hasidim in stork, his influence spread throughout the Jewish world. So in the Arab world, where Jews were eating storks until this period, they simply gradually stopped. And also, when the Bible was translated into English, King James Version, or German, Luther's translation, and later translations too. If you look in your translated Bible, you'll see that where it says Hasidah in Hebrew, in English, or whatever other language, it says stork now. So that's Rashi's influence on Hebrew and on modern Hebrew too, and on kashrut rules. So we see that words change meaning unrelated, not through use, but also through interpretation. And that's another lesson. So if you were to speak to King David and you would say, oh, look, a Hasidah, he might not understand you because he thinks that that word means something else. We're back to the Bible. And we'll mention some other changes that took place. So we talked about early biblical Hebrew changing through the fall of Judah and the expulsion of Jews. There were several changes, and one of those changes was the adoption of non-Hebrew words from the empires. So a very important language that very much changed Hebrew forever is Aramaic. By the time that this happened, that Judah fell and the Second Temple arrived, there were no Arameans anymore. This people had disappeared. But their language was adopted by the Babylonians as the official language for official business. So letters and laws and contracts were often written in Aramaic. That was the language of the scribes in the empire. And this remained after the Babylonian empire fell and the Persians came to power. They spoke Persian, but they also adopted Aramaic as the official language of the empire. So there's a lot of Aramaic words in the Bible, the influence of Aramaic, and even more so in rabbinic literature, which, as you probably know, the Talmud is mostly written in Aramaic. So a lot of Aramaic influence on Hebrew during the Second Temple period and beyond, but also Persian influence. Just some examples, the word igeret for letter, that's like a fancy word for letter today. So that comes from Aramaic. The word pidgam, which originally meant proclamation and now means idiom, that comes from Aramaic. And some words from Persian, the word pardes, which is in modern Hebrew, an orchard, or specifically an orchard of citrus fruit, that meant like a pleasure garden or a enclosed garden in Persian. And the word dat, which is the Hebrew word for religion, is the Persian word for law. So we're now moved from biblical Hebrew to the Second Temple. So all these effects are happening on Hebrew, right? Hebrew is changing by the influence of other languages, but also the language is slowly dying in the sense that many people are not speaking Hebrew as their first language. So we said the language in the Second Temple period is no longer biblical Hebrew, it's a different dialect. And it's still a spoken language. Many people speak it, raise their children in it, whisper words of love to one another in it. But it's gradually becoming less and less so because in the cities, the elite, they're better off just speaking Aramaic or Greek, because you can speak to merchants, you can speak to the imperial overlords, you can appear in court, whatever it is, the cities become less and less Hebrew speaking, while the rural people, they don't have anyone to talk to. They're working in the fields and they retain their Hebrew. So as we know, eventually Hebrew dies out. So there's a gradual process. And we know that during the Bar Kochva revolt, that Hebrew was still spoken. How do we know this? Because we found in the Judean desert this amazing collection of letters in a cave, and this is one of them. And some of them, many of them, are written by hand by none other than Bar Kochva himself. You can see in the top of the letter, it says, Mishimon ben Kusiba. That's his name, from Bar Kochva. It wasn't really Bar Kochva, it was Bar Kusiba, but that's a different story. And he was somewhat a mean boss. He's like threatening his underlings that if they don't do something, he'll put them in shackles. שאני נותן את הכבלים ברגליכם כמו שעשיתי. So that's like, look in the bottom row. שאני נותן את הכבלים. It should be את הכבלים. That's how you would say it. But he's not a scribe and not a very like educated person apparently. And he doesn't write it the way it's supposed to be written. He writes it how he hears it. So for him, it's not et hakvalim, it's takvalim. So he attaches the letter taf to the next word, kvalim, shackles. Now, what's amazing about this, in addition to the fact that it's actually written by Bar Kochva himself, that even today, when Israelis send messages on WhatsApp, they will also do the same thing. They will, instead of using et hakvalim or et ha-mail or whatever it is, they'll also use a taf with an apostrophe and connect it to the next word, because that language impulse of talking quickly and you know scrunching up words together to speak fast, that existed then, exists today. It's the same impulse. So we did the same things. And sometimes you write the way you hear. And Bar Kochva did it, and we do it today. So it's a beautiful parallel how the Hebrew of then and the Hebrew of today are similar. So we know in the second century, we're talking about 165 CE, after the destruction of the Second Temple, that Hebrew is still a spoken language. We're going to move a little more forward to Rabbinic Hebrew. And this is a story preserved in the Babylonian Talmud, but it's about Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the person who compiled the Mishnah. So we're talking about the very beginning of the third century. And there's a story there that Rabbi Judah the Prince did not understand what the word matate means. This is in Isaiah. The prophet says that the Babylonians will be swept away with a broom by God. But the rabbis, they already didn't know what a matate is, because once again, they are the urban elite. They've already switched to speaking Aramaic or Greek, probably both in some cases. They knew Hebrew, but it wasn't their day-to-day spoken language. And how did they discover that matate means broom? They heard one of the cleaning lady use it, and she's obviously from the lower levels, so she's from some town, and we can already see this stratification. The lower levels still preserve Hebrew as a spoken language, while the elite is already a literary language. A very similar story, probably the same story, and probably the original version of the story, appears in the Jerusalem Talmud, but instead of the broom being the word they didn't know, um, by the way, the word for broom in Aramaic is michbedet, so probably that's the word that Rabbi Judah the Prince knew, and not matate. So there's another story in the Jerusalem Talmud, as I said, that the rabbis after Rabbi Judah the Prince, they didn't know what the word sirugin means. That's intermittently, like one comes in first, and then another one, and then another one. So that appears in the Mishnah. So in other words, Rabbi Judah the Prince used this word, and later generations of the rabbis, in the later third century, maybe the fourth century, they didn't understand it until the cleaning lady and their Beit Midrash and their learning center was like complaining, "Hey, why are you coming in sirugin into here? I'm trying to clean here." And that's how they learned what he meant. So once again, it's the same idea. The lower classes still retained a Hebrew as a spoken language, so they had a richer understanding, knew more words, while the higher classes, the urban people, had already lost it as a spoken language. And this process went until sometime in the fourth century, maybe the fifth century. Some old lady died, and she happened to be, she probably didn't even know it, the last native speaker of Hebrew. And Hebrew was a dead language. A dead language is a technical term. It means there are no more, there are no native speakers of the language, and that was certainly the case. But just because a language is dead, it doesn't mean that the language wasn't used or very important. Hebrew remained very, very alive, and Jews used it constantly. They just didn't use it as their spoken language. Jews, wherever they were, in the Arab world, they spoke Judeo-Arabic. In France, they spoke Judeo-French. And in Italy, they spoke Judeo-Italian. In Spain, they would speak Judeo-Spanish, which we call Ladino. In Germany, Judeo-German, which we call Yiddish. etc. So everyone had their spoken language that they spoke in day-to-day life, but they also used Hebrew constantly. They used Hebrew in their prayer, when they were reading the Torah, when they wrote letters, when they wrote books about even non-religious subjects. Hebrew remained very active. It was the literary language. And we call this situation where people use more than one language, or two languages, for different uh, aspects of their life. It's called diglossia. And it's a very common thing. It's actually somewhat uncommon to only use one language. And some examples from the real world that are parallel to the way Hebrew was used in the Middle Ages is medieval Latin. So once again, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Spaniards, whatever they were, they would speak in their respective languages. But when they wrote a book or read a book or prayed, they would use Latin. When they would write a letter, most people couldn't write, but they would go to a scribe who would write, and that person would write in Latin. So that's a similar thing. And, another example is Arabic today. There are many dialects of Arabic, and they're very, very different. Moroccan Arabic is very different from Iraqi Arabic or from Egyptian Arabic. But the use of Arabic, the dialects of Arabic, that's something that people use at home. But when they go to school, they don't learn how to read and write the language they speak at home. They learn modern standard Arabic, and that's the same Arabic in the whole Arab world. And when they read the newspaper, they read in that Arabic. When they write a book, it will be in that languages. Even on TV, when they watch the news would be typically presented in modern standard Arabic and not in the spoken Arabic. So that situation of diglossia is a very common phenomenon, and that's what Hebrew was like for hundreds of years in the Middle Ages. So yes, dead languages, but very much alive. And as a language that's alive, it also evolved and changed. Very interesting example of this, or the livelihood of Hebrew, is in the 12th and the 13th century, there was a massive translation movement. Many books were translated from Arabic into Hebrew. Um, why did this happen? Because at the time, the Arab world was the pinnacle of science, philosophy, technology, astronomy, medicine, and Europe was a backwater with primitive people that didn't know anything. Now, the Sephardic Jews, the Jews of the Arab world, felt bad for their brethren in Europe that they were so primitive and didn't know anything. So what was the problem? The European Jews just couldn't read Arabic, and all the good books were written in Arabic. And when I say good books, I mean also Maimonides' books. Maimonides wrote his books in Arabic. Um, Also, books of medicine. The Kuzari, a very important book by Yehuda Levi, a work on philosophy that was also written in Arabic. So for Jews to be able to read it in Europe, it needed to be translated, and the language they read it in was Hebrew. So this was for 200 years, a little more. Many Jews participated, but the most important people who participated in this was one dynasty, the Tibonides, the grandfather, Yehuda ibn Tibon, his son, and then his grandson. And they translated a lot of very important books into Hebrew, and they're preserved in Hebrew through their translations. There were other people who also did it that weren't related to them. And they all faced a difficulty because when you're translating books on science and philosophy into Hebrew, you're obviously going to have a problem with terminology. Many terms this don't appear in the Bible, don't appear in the Mishnah, you don't have a word for them. And through these translations, many, many words came in, either formed from Hebrew, within Hebrew, as new terms, or just borrowed from Arabic. Here are some examples. So the word for a diameter of a circle, is, in Hebrew, it's a kotel. That sounds like a Hebrew word completely. Nobody would suspect it, but it actually just comes from Arabic. The word for pole, like the poles, is kotev in Hebrew. That just comes from Arabic. There was no word for it in Hebrew, so they just took the Arabic word. And maybe most amazing, the word for center, mirkaz, that also comes from Arabic, and that spawned verbs and a whole vocabulary, and that is borrowed from Arabic during this period. A few more examples. The Hebrew word for climate, aklim, that comes from the Arabic word aklim, which is also the source of the English word climate. The word for tune, lachan, also just borrowed from Arabic. Teva, the word for nature. That's a bit different because it's a borrowing. The word is tab'a in Arabic. So it is a borrowing from Arabic, but the root tet bet ayin means to imprint in Hebrew and also in Arabic. Your nature is something that's imprinted in you. So in a way, it's true that it's a borrowing from Arabic, but it's also formed from a biblical root, the root, biblical Hebrew root, tet bet ayin. So it's a bit of both in that case. An example of words that were formed within Hebrew and not borrowed from Arabic. So Abraham Bar Kochva was translating a book on mathematics. He had a problem with words for polygons. Now, the word mishulash, which is triangle in Hebrew, that appears in the Bible, but it means tripartite in the Bible, like something with three parts. In rabbinic literature, it already means triangle. So mishulash is a triangle from the word shalosh, for three. Meruba, quadrilateral, from the word arba, four sides, also appears in rabbinic literature. But what Abraham Bar Kochva didn't have is words for pentagon, hexagon, but he just followed that example of mishulash from shalosh, meruba from arba, so he created bechumash from chamesh, meshushe from shesh. He didn't create metuman, which is a octagon, because he used meshuman, but that's a different story for another day. I'd like to talk about a few more examples of fun words from the Middle Ages. And one of my favorite stories is the story of the word karnan. So this took place in Troyes, France, in the 11th century. And it's a letter that the Jews of Troyes, the community, sent to a different rabbi for advice what to do with their situation. What was the situation that was troubling them? One of the men in their community took in a partner that wasn't Jewish, some Goyish lady, as the partner. So that happened. But the problem was that she was troublesome. And we have sort of like the minutes from a community meeting where they're complaining about her in this letter. One guy says, "Me, she struck with a stick." Another guy says, "My wife, she called a whore." And then a third man says, "Me, she called a karnan." Now, karnan, this is the only appearance of this word anywhere until the modern period. So it only appears in this one sentence, in this one letter, in this one book. And so obviously it's not exactly clear what it is, but it's also clear that this lady, she didn't call him a karnan. She was some French lady. She spoke French. And the word she used was connard. That's a man whose wife is unfaithful. And then and now it's a common insult, and it makes sense that that's what you call them. And it turned into karnan in this letter. It's not clear if when the letter was written originally, somebody translated this term, because karnan comes from horn, okay? And keren from karnan is also horn. the metaphor of a man whose wife is unfaithful, having horns, and this is that's what that gesture comes from too. So bunny ears in pictures, that's what it originally means. And in many, many languages, including Arabic, including Greek and European languages, that's the metaphor, and the word comes from words for horns. So it's not clear if when they translated the letter originally, they created this word, or this word already existed and happens to only be recorded in that one letter. Or originally it said some kind of transliteration of the French word, and somebody who copied it until it entered the book and was printed, it changed into that by influence of the word keren. But whatever it is, that word was preserved there, karnan, a word for a man whose wife was unfaithful. Now, nobody used this word. It was only in this one letter until Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was working on his dictionaries and his project of reviving the Hebrew language. So he found this book. He was scouring it for words he didn't know to put in his dictionary, and found that word, and I'm sure he was really excited. And he put it in an envelope and cataloged it into his system, and eventually it appeared in one of his dictionaries, though nobody used it. And in fact, it remained only a word that appears in some dictionaries, either Ben Yehuda's dictionary or other dictionaries that just copied from Ben Yehuda's dictionary, until in the 1960s, somebody was translating Commedia dell'arte, Italian plays, and needed a word for a man whose wife is unfaithful, and found it inside one of these dictionaries and used it. And since the word is in use, not much, I don't know, it's not a common word, many people don't know it, but if you Google it, you'll see it appears here and there in literature, and that's how that word came about. Another different example, although also a little dirty, for how Hebrew words were used in the Middle Ages has to do with anatomy. So there's the backside, the thing we sit on, and in the Bible there are several words for that part of the body, including shet. But those words didn't continue into Rabbinic Hebrew. Instead, in Rabbinic Hebrew, you usually see the word akuz. There's also other words there too. And then in the Middle Ages, we suddenly see a new word appear and begin to be used with this sense, and that's the word tachat. Tachat is originally, it appears in the Bible many times. It's just a preposition meaning beneath or under. But in Rabbeinu Hananel, who's an important Talmudic commentator, that's the first time we see he uses the word tachat to mean that part of the human body. Then, I think this is the 17th century, in a dictionary called Hatishbi, written in Italy, under the word tachat, the explanation, he mentions that the common folk in their common language, they use the word tachat to refer to the backside. But he was talking about Yiddish, and in Yiddish was pronounced differently than modern Israeli Hebrew, and also biblical Hebrew, of course. So under the first taf in that word, there's a kamatz, which I and Israelis pronounce as a vowel, so it's ta. But in Yiddish, they pronounced kamatz as a o, so it wasn't a ta, it was a to. And the second taf is a taf out of the gesh, and that wasn't pronounced like in modern Hebrew as t. It was pronounced as an s. So that's actually that in Yiddish they use this Hebrew word, but they pronounce it as toches, and that was the common Yiddish word for that part of the body. Now, sometimes you would take toches and you wanted to talk about a smaller bottom, and you could add a diminutive suffix to it. There were different diminutive suffixes used in Yiddish, but one of them was ik. So you could take toches, tochsik, and that turned into tosik, tusik, which entered into oh, it doesn't matter. Entered into a modern Israeli Hebrew. So today, a small child's buttocks is a tusik, and that we use in modern Israeli Hebrew. And now, not everyone who spoke Yiddish, as you definitely know, immigrated to Israel. Many people went to America. And there, the Yiddish word toches turned into tush and started as a Jewish word, but it became a common word and acute behind in modern English is tush, and they both come from the same biblical word, tachat, beneath, under.
Do we,
So now,
I don't mean to interrupt, but I would love to get to some questions.
sure.
Okay.
Uh,
As-
okay.
Do you want to, if you want to finish this slide and then we can go into it, or we can go straight in?
Let's do some questions. Sure.
Okay, great. Because we only have, well, we only have technically 3 more minutes, but we can go over a little bit. So let's take a look. There's a couple questions here specifically about how Ben Yehuda chose between Ashkenazi and Sephardic pronunciations when he was developing the modern Hebrew lexicon.
Okay. So they he was there with a group of obviously he came from Europe, so he was Perlman. He came from Eastern Europe, and for him it was the Ashkenazi pronunciation. But he when he immigrated to Jerusalem, he lived in Jerusalem. He met with other interested parties, and some of them, many of them, were non-Ashkenazi, in other words, from the Arab world, Sephardic, or whatever you want to call it. And they decided that the Sephardic pronunciation, in some aspects of it, not all of them, they were more authentic. Now, this is true in some aspects, but not in all of them. So in terms of pronunciation, many times they went with the Sephardic pronunciation um, because they thought it was closer to the original biblical or Mishnaic version. And in some cases, many cases, it was. In other cases, it wasn't. For example, the distinction between a taf with a dagesh and a taf without a dagesh, which Ashkenazi Hebrew did preserve, it wasn't preserved in the Sephardic Hebrew, and that's why in modern Israeli Hebrew we don't distinguish between a taf with a dagesh and a taf without a dagesh. On the other hand, there were certain aspects that they wanted to bring in. For example, um, pronouncing Ein and Aleph, which they were just unable to do. They weren't able to pull it off. Ben Yehuda pulled it off well, but most of the people around him and the early adopters of Hebrew, they were mostly from Europe, and they just couldn't pronounce those consonants that don't exist in Yiddish or other European languages, and that didn't work. So they didn't adopt those.
Fantastic, thank you. And then were there any specific sources that he used when developing this lexicon as well, or was it really just the individuals around him?
When Ben Yehuda was coining words.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'm gonna go long if that's okay. I have a nice example for
that's
that.
okay, perfect. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So this is a list of words that I verified that Ben Yehuda actually coined. So we're not going to go over all of them. I'll just give one example just to show the genius of Ben Yehuda. So the Hebrew word for doll, buba. Ben Yehuda coined it in 1904, and it first appears in a reader for young children learning Hebrew. It has like French translation. You can follow ahead. It appears in this sentence. Don't come at me. This is Ben Yehuda's handiwork. The doll is one of a little girl's strongest needs. Without a doll, a little girl is almost as miserable as a woman without without children. So this word, buba, he made it up. How did he make it up? The inspiration comes from the French word for doll, poupée. Now, poupée comes from the Latin word pupa, which is girl or doll. Now, Ben Yehuda knew this, and he also knew that the word for pupil in Latin is pupula, which is the diminutive of pupa. So, pupil, the word pupil of the eye comes from the Latin pupula, means little girl. It's a diminutive of girl or doll. Why? Because when you look into someone close into their pupil, you'll see a little person looking back at you, your reflection. And in many languages, ancient Greek, ancient Egyptian, and Spanish, and Arabic, you have this pupils being named after little person, little child. And Ben Yehuda said, okay, so I don't have a word for doll, but maybe I can find a word for pupil and form the word for doll from it. And he found it. In Zechariah, there's a word that appears only once in the phrase bavateni. That's translated the apple of my eye. And that's where the phrase apple of my eye comes from. And bava, we're not sure exactly where it comes from. It could be from gate, the gate of the eye, because bava is gate in Aramaic, or it could be a Semitic word for little boy. In Akkadian, there's a word sort of like boo-boo. In Arabic, there's a word like that. It means a little chubby boy. So he said, "Oh, the bavateni, that little word for pupil, that comes from also from little boy, just like the Latin word pupula. So bava actually means also little boy and also a pupil. So he took bava and he just changed the vowels a little and turned it into buba, and that's where the word comes. So he did really deep dives into words to coin new words, and buba is definitely a very nice example of that. Do you want to do another example, or should I keep going? Another question, or should I keep going?
Ella, let's do one more question, and then unfortunately we're gonna have to end for today. But
Okay.
I'm getting a lot of comments about maybe we'll need to bring you back for a series. So I see this continuing in our future. But let's do just one more question. Um, hold on one sec. Can you recommend a course of Hebrew lexicology?
Oof. Course, we mean a book. Um,
Or you know what? Maybe we do the course on Hebrew lexicology. Maybe that's what we do next. Maybe that's the answer. Um,
I can't say a course for sure I don't know of. Even books, it's in English. It's a tough one. I wouldn't say that there are many. There's a Klein, which was a professor of Hebrew in Haifa, I think, and he wrote a etymological dictionary of Hebrew. He also wrote etymological dictionary of English, and it's I wonder if I have it here behind me. Yeah. So it's this book, and it gives the etymology in English of Hebrew words. Uh, I wouldn't say it's very in depth, but he'll give you in a few words where most Hebrew words come from, and maybe that's a good solution.
all right, excellent. No, I think this can be an expansive conversation that we continue in the future. Ellen, we'd love to have you back at some point, but at this time we do have to close out. Are there any final remarks that you would like to share with those who are on with us today?
Well, I hope that what's it called? We didn't get into modern Hebrew too much, and I apologize for going long. But I hope that going through the backstory of Hebrew made you your connection to Hebrew a little deeper, and mostly I hope it whets your appetite and makes you want to learn more to use Hebrew, but also look into the history of Hebrew and its development because um, I don't know if Hebrew is the most beautiful language in the world, but I think it has the most interesting stories in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alon. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. Definitely keep an eye out for future opportunities about the etymology of modern Hebrew. And thank you again to our sponsors who have made this program free and accessible to all of us today. Uh, have an incredible rest of your Yom Haatzmaut. Good evening to you, Alon, and to your family. And we will see you all next time.